Okay, I would just really like it if some more of you would move up a little further. Feel a lot more class. Oh, this is great. Yes, thank you. Right, turn your Bibles to 1 John chapter 4. 1 John, almost in the back, just before Jude, and chapter 4. Okay, I've been thinking for a while to teach with just a whiteboard. That's kind of what I was used to at school, only a chalkboard. Prefer chalkboard much more over whiteboards. Whiteboards are one of the products of modernity that's been a failure, in my opinion. But anyway, so we'll try this. And I know it's not pictures for the children. And, you know, like the YouTubers say, let me know in the comments what you think. What do you prefer? So, all right. So in 1 John 4, we got the dear Apostle John, who is quite old. And he's writing, but he makes some very startling pronouncements here in this 4th chapter of 1 John. So let's have someone, we'll read 1, 2, and 3. So just anyone can read, a verse at a time. So someone read verse 1, then verse 2, then verse 3. Read clearly, distinctly. Go. All right, thank you. So Jesus taught many things, and he emphasized lots of moral teachings. So you should not be hypocritical in your heart, but you should love with a true, genuine heart. You should be pure, not just outwardly, but inwardly. But now John is saying, you are not Christian if what? What does he say? He's drawing a line here. There is one thing here that means you're not Christian. If you, what does he say? Okay, if Jesus Christ is not the Son of God, and Drew, what was you going to say? Same thing? Okay, can you just, a little more. You kind of missed one word. Not just that Jesus is the Son of God, but confesseth that, what else about Jesus? That he came in the flesh. Okay, so John says, if you don't believe and confess that Jesus came in the flesh, you're not Christian. In fact, you're Antichrist. Now, how many would agree that there's more to the Christian life than just believing that one thing? We all agree with that? Why do you, and look, this doesn't have anything to do with how you would live. Doesn't really have anything to do with how you treat your neighbor, or whether you lie, steal, kill, none of that. This is just a theological understanding, belief. And yet John says, if you don't get this one right, you're Antichrist. Now, I would be curious, do any of you have any ideas? Why was John so strong about this one particular thing? Any ideas? Now, this does have something to do with the lesson tonight. So we're going somewhere here. Okay, you need a little knowledge of church history, and Duncan should know this. Sorry, Duncan, putting you on the spot. There were this group of people very early on who started going a wrong way and yet claimed to be Christians. Who were they? The Gnostics. Look at that. He remembers. Good for you. So the Gnostics had some really strange ideas. We call them strange. Apparently they didn't think they were strange, or they wouldn't have believed them. But they saw the God of the Old Testament. They believed that everything physical was bad. Apparently they struggled with sin and the pull of the flesh, and they saw all the problems in the world. They said everything physical is bad and is evil. And so the God that supposedly created the earth that's talked about in the Old Testament is not a good God. But Jesus came and introduced a new era, and they aren't the same gods. The God of the Old Testament and Jesus aren't the same. And so and of course, because they thought all physical things were evil, then they said Jesus could not have been born a real physical person. He just seemed to be. He just was a kind of spiritual being. And then they had all kinds of things related to that. Now, does that help us understand why John would be saying this? John is deliberately countering an existential threat. That means a threat that was in their time. And he is clarifying to all Christians that if you're following the teachings of the Gnostics, you're Antichrist. You must believe that Jesus Christ came in the flesh. And if you don't, you're not Christian. Now, of course, John thought there was more to the Christian life than that. But at this one point, he very vehemently, this is passionate. You can't be Christian if you don't get this right. So what we're saying is, it seems here that John is writing with this kind of force because he's responding to. Now, I was trying to decide, maybe we can have discussion, is it best to say responding to or reacting to, and is there a difference to that? But there was this threat coming against the church. And when we think of a threat, it's kind of like this wall of water. It's like the tide is coming up and coming in, and it's here, and it's going to drown us. And so there's the felt and even desperate feeling of needing to push back, or we're going to be overtaken. And that's what John's doing, and that's why he's writing with such force. Now, coming all the way around to say, tonight the lesson is titled Modernity and Fundamentalism. Now, I'm curious, how many have heard of either of these two words before? Okay, some of you have. I was worried nobody had a clue what these words meant, which is kind of exciting because maybe we can figure it out. But what we have going on is one of these is the threat, and the other is the response to the threat. And I would just like to, at any point, have discussion. Is that a good way to live? How should we respond to threats? What do you all think? What is that necessary to respond to what we see as threats? And what are dangers in responding to threats? What can often happen when you're responding to this threat that is kind of in front of you? What do you think?
We tend to go off the other side.
All right. We got this human tendency to kind of this pendulum humans and as a group of people, do we tend to think the same about how we should respond to threats? Or is there often opportunity for disagreement about how we should respond to something? Yeah. I was trying to think of, so we have this current problem right now that farmers do. It was really wet all summer, and so the corn has a lot of disease in it. And a lot of people spray fungicide on their corn, and then, the people that know started looking around, just corn that was sprayed maybe a couple weeks ago, they're saying, no, the disease is back again. And so you should probably spray again. Now I was just thinking, okay, there could be all kinds of responses to this threat. You could have maybe, some people say, oh, come on, we never used to spray. This is just something natural. It just happens, and it's not near as big a deal as some people are trying to make it. Or, it actually could be good for the corn. It has to die somehow. You can't harvest it. So it's just a natural way that. And then you have, the others, the ones that are really studying it and they're really, kind of aware of saying, no, this is serious. If you don't do something, you're going to have a drastically reduced yield. It's really important. Yeah, is that kind of like it? Yeah. We have these perceived threats to our Christianity, to what we consider important and serious, that we don't always agree how we should respond. And as Cletus points out, sometimes the response swings a little. That's kind of what this lesson's about tonight. So, what is modernity? Well, we all kind of know what the word modern means. What does modern mean? Well, actually, when you have to define it, maybe not quite so easy. In just layman's terms, what is modern? Someone says,
something new and up to date.
New and up to date. So it comes from the Latin word that just means the now. Kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Yeah. Yeah, so modern is, and that's the way we understand it and probably always will. But it turns out, when we're talking about the term modernity, and you could also say modernism, kind of the same thing, noun forms of modern. It's actually in history or social sciences, it's considered to be a period of time. It's an actual period. So we're talking about, yes, modernity, it does mean what we think it means, but it also means just a little bit more. And the more is, kind of starting maybe in about the 1600s, 1700s is what's considered the beginning of the modern period. And so, prior to that, it was called the Dark Ages. And interestingly, the people that lived kind of in those 1500s are the ones that said that it was the Dark Ages. So they saw themselves as very enlightened. But in kind of 1700s, that's considered when the modern period begins. I'll just put in there 1600s, 1700s, somewhere right in there is the modern. So in that period, sometimes called the early modern period. Now, what defines modernity is this advancement in, this is probably some of your favorite subject, what started to advance very rapidly in this period? It's a school subject. Prior to this, it was kind of almost unknown, at least as we understand it today. What's the school subject that started to just bloom? Science. Okay? So, the scientific method was, discoveries just started to explode. It really did. So the world had existed all these thousands of years and was basically very little had really changed as far as industrialization and just lots of discoveries. But starting in kind of that 1600s, and probably a little before that, but it really started to pick up steam. And that's what we mean by the modern period. That's modernity. And so what started to change? What are some things that you can think of that started to change? What are some discoveries that just happened in these last 500 years, 400 years? Name a few, quickly.
Printing press.
The printing press, okay? Steam power, as well as all kinds of other powers. What's the one that's keeping the lights on? Electricity. Just revolutionized things. Think of any more? Do you know the man Isaac Newton? Okay, so he's the man that just figured out all these, how the forces work and the principles of physics. And suddenly the secrets of the universe that had been shrouded in mystery started to be unlocked one at a time. There were huge advancements in medicine. So diseases that were mysterious and people just died and you didn't know what it was, and so there's all kinds of superstitions, suddenly starting to understand what's really happening. And doctors started to do autopsies. At first that seemed a little weird, but some courageous doctors started to take people who just died, cut them open, and started to figure out why they died. And suddenly it didn't feel so mysterious anymore. Well, this growth of knowledge and the unlocking of the mysteries of the universe has brought about all of the, dare I say, wonderful, yeah, we kind of like it pretty well, all the wonderful things we enjoy today. That's what we mean by modernity. Now, you read your lessons. If you did, right? It didn't just stay with physical, mechanical, and wonderful inventions. How else did this new way of understanding things, how else did it affect the world? Someone read it? What'd you see? It affected the culture. Great. In what ways?
You mentioned dress.
Pardon?
Dress and style.
Dresses and style. Yep. I'm wanting to think about how people thought. So their mindset and their beliefs. How did modernity start to affect that? And this it was picking up in the 1700s, but really got going in the 1800s. Okay? So remember we said it was this time of unlocking the mysteries of the universe. Well, prior to this, if there was some kind of strange weather, you just, blamed one of the gods if you were pagan, but if you were Christian, you saw the hand of the Almighty God in it. If someone died or there was disease, you perhaps saw it as a curse from God. Any phenomenon that you didn't understand tended to be simply credited to God. And particularly in the Western world, that was Christianized, it was the Christian God. Well, as these thinkers and scientists started to understand more and more and more of the mysteries of the universe, they said, all God really is a way to explain what we didn't understand. And now that we can pretty much figure everything out, guess what? We don't need God anymore. In fact, we don't even think He's there. And this Friedrich Nietzsche, did you see that? Had the gall to say, what did he say? Sometime in the early 1800s.
God is dead.
God is dead. Now, what he meant by that is, in the minds of the modern world and the intellectuals, God doesn't exist anymore. We don't need Him, and we don't even think He's there. And so, when we talk about modernity, We are talking about scientific discovery, explaining the universe, unlocking the mysteries of the universe, and discovering that, you know what? There's no such thing as the miraculous and the supernatural. That was all a myth. It was just all a way to explain things we didn't understand. Now that we know better, we know there's no such thing. So when we talk about modernity, it is not just all these scientific, this explosion of scientific inventions, but it's this new way of thinking that God doesn't exist, that we don't need God. There is no such thing as a supernatural. Miracles are a myth. And this came full bore on in the 1800s. Well, one thing very sacred to us is being attacked when you say miracles aren't true. Nothing miraculous, nothing supernatural is true. What is this that's very sacred to us today is under attack here? The resurrection, of course, but I'm thinking of the document, the Bible. And so modernism and modernity is really attacking the Bible. So it's an anti-Bible is really what it's coming down to, because it's saying, all those stories in the Bible that talk of miracles that obviously are not physical, well, we know they're not true anymore. That's what the modern intellectual was saying. Now, those who were followers of Christ suddenly found themselves with this onslaught, this wave, like John with the Gnostics. Like the tide is coming in, and it was real. So there were unfortunately, plenty of Christians who decided, you know what? If we don't get relevant here and we don't start, kind of changing a little bit, we're not gonna be respected at all. And so, very sadly, lots of Christian thinkers in the universities, in churches, in the seminaries, started changing how they believe. And so they started to think, maybe the miracles aren't true. Maybe there's things about the Bible that we thought were true, but stop to think about it. How do we know for sure? And so there was this attack on the Bible that's sometimes called higher criticism, where you start to really scrutinize the Bible and try to prove if it is or isn't true. And so, they would say things like, well, these books in the New Testament, we say Paul wrote them. Well, there's actually no proof of that. And probably someone else wrote them and just claimed to be Paul. And so they started changing the dates of when things were written. Now, there is a particular Old Testament book that came under a lot of attack. Can you think of an Old Testament book that has clear prophecy of world events that actually happened just years after it was written? And it was so clear, so easy to understand, you couldn't deny it. Which book am I thinking of? The book of Daniel. He sees this image, and it says, okay, here's Babylon, and there's going to be another kingdom, and that's Persia, and the Greeks, and then there's going to be another kingdom, and that's the Roman. And it's so clear, and it all came to pass. And so these higher criticism, these new modern thinkers said, okay, so there's no way that was written in the Babylonian era, because you couldn't have known that. Remember, we're denying anything supernatural. And so they said, actually that was written much later, No, it couldn't have been. That's the kind of stuff that's going on. It's this big tie. Well, so in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there were Christians, solid Christians, who got really concerned about this and felt the need to respond, to push back. Because if we don't, we're all going to get swallowed up. It's going to just wipe us away. And that's the rise of fundamentalism. Now, you can see fundamentalism. What do we mean by something that's fundamental? Yeah, just layman's definition. What do we mean by something that's fundamental?
Most basic.
The most basic, so it's this. Let's cut through and let's say what are the basics of what is Christianity. So the things you have to believe or you're not Christian. So it's kind of like what John was doing. If you don't believe that Jesus Christ came in the flesh, you're not Christians. So these Christian people were trying to do that. And in the 10s, teens, and 20s, there were these meetings, and lots of good Christian thinkers got together, and they decided to draw together a document, and they called it Christian Fundamentals. And I think there was some people who funded it, a couple brothers, I think, wealthy brothers, and they actually printed hundreds of these, maybe even thousands, and sent it out to Christians everywhere for free. And it was this desire to push back against this flood. So some of the things, now let's just name let's think of the New Testament. What are some of the things that we today consider essential to Christianity that if you did not believe in the supernatural, you would deny, and you would say it's not true? So just think, what are some things in the New Testament, in the life of Jesus, that simply, if you say there's no such thing as the miraculous, you would say it's not true? Let's name a few. The virgin birth. Okay? You know what? Probably prior to this time of the fundamentals, that phrase that's so familiar to us, believe in the virgin birth, you probably rarely heard that. But now suddenly, that was under attack. And so it needed to be defended. What else about the life of Jesus? The resurrection. Very fundamental. And there's just, all the miracles he did, it just goes on and on. And so, one by one, these men, who we now call fundamentalists, started writing out systematically, these are the things you must believe. And they drew this list up. And agreed to stand on it. Now, remember that kind of at the heart of it all was the defense of the Bible. And it's important to remember that, and these people are Protestant, by the way. This isn't a Catholic thing, really. It's Protestant, and primarily in the United States, that's doing this pushing back. Now, do you remember in the Reformation, Martin Luther had kind of these two slogans, these two solas. And one of those was that you are born again, you are a Christian, you're saved by faith alone. And then he says the only infallible rule for faith and life is the Bible. And that was sola scriptura. So the Bible alone is our only infallible rule for faith and life. And so this was like the whole point of the Reformation was that the Bible is, and I should hold my Bible up here, is the only rule. And so the Bible became became such an important part of Protestant Christianity. And it was to Anabaptists too. And so when these moderns and these scientific intellectuals were saying there's nothing miraculous, basically they were ripping apart the Bible. And so the fundamentalists were, at all costs, we're going to protect the Bible, the Scriptures, and defend it. Now, we said that sometimes when you do that, a few things can happen. Not everybody's going to agree how it should be done. Not everybody's going to agree how much you should do. And there's a tendency to swing too far. So I'd be curious, can you think of any potential pitfalls that could come with this kind of desire to defend the Bible in this way?
We can decide that if it's not the Bible, then it's not important to do.
Okay? So, yeah, just it just kind of shored up this idea that it must be in the Bible, or you don't need to pay any attention to it. Okay? Anyone else? Okay, a couple things that's kind of come out of this. Well, number one, it's a lot of positive. It really is. Has anyone heard of the KJV only movement? Anybody heard of that idea? Yeah, it's well known, isn't it? That's a product of fundamentalism, where it's going to say, okay, the Bible is uniquely inspired, it's inerrant, and then it started moving to, there are actually some versions that are, maybe you don't quite say it, but it sure feels that way, more inspired than others. And, one of the things that, and Anabaptists got taken up with this, and they admired these fundamentalists, and they found a lot of common ground with them. They're defending the Scriptures. Of course, that's important to Mennonites and Amish. But the problem is, there were still some significant differences. Number one, all right, so when you think today of back up, school curriculum, okay, that's fundamentalism. That comes out of this movement. Bob Jones University comes out of this kind of movement. Now, when you think of those people, what's one thing that kind of pops to your mind real quickly that's quite different than Mennonites?
Very patriotic.
They're very patriotic. So for some reason, with this fundamentalist movement, these people tended to be heavily patriotic for the United States, for America as a land. The other thing that is a bit different is there's kind of this fighting spirit in these fundamentalists. Okay, we're not just standing on the Bible and its truth, but we're defending it and we're pushing back with a spirit that's militant. Okay? Any of you kind of know what I'm talking about? That's different than Mennonites and Amish were used to. And John MacArthur passed away recently, and so many things I appreciate about him. Took a real stand on a lot of scriptural things. But I think this is reflected in his response during COVID. Do anyone read some of that story? Where, in California there, was it Los Angeles where he was? They were, trying to say that they couldn't have church, and they just kept having church anyway, and then they sued him, and he got So it was felt like Christian rights not only need to be kept in our personal life, but they must be defended. And we need to push back against liberalism and this modernism. Okay, so again, that found itself a bit at odds. And still does with historic Anabaptism. Now, I just realized I missed a word. So this whole development of modernism that affected Christians, that's what is meant by liberalism. Now, I know when Mennonites and Amish talk about liberals, they tend to talk about the ones that, wear clothing that's more worldly than they're used to, or more permissive and have fewer rules in their church, that's liberal. And in our sense, it is. But when you hear the terminology of liberal theology or liberalism in Christian circles, what is meant by that is those Christians who have adopted this modern mindset of anti-miraculous or anti-supernatural. And so liberal theologians are those who deny things like virgin birth and things that are miraculous. And so and that became the Gnostic from John to the fundamentalists. That become the great evil, the slippery slope, the edge of the precipice that you worried and feared of going over. And so the fundamentalists, there's this constant, and this thing built steam and is still going today, where the worst of all evils and sins is if you would get swept into liberal theology. And so their whole Christianity tends to be focused on pushing back against the liberalism and liberal theology. Again, not meaning liberal quite in the same way Amish and Mennonites do. Now, how did it affect Mennonites? Well, what did you read? What are some ways it affected Mennonites? They started colleges. Why? Now, what did fundamentalism have to do with starting colleges? You're right. Okay, that's a good answer, or a good start to an answer. So, anybody want to help Kevin? Why did starting colleges? Why was that copying the fundamentalists?
Yeah, so they think right, or understand.
Yeah. Okay, that's right. Anybody want to add to that?
They also were facing think of the name of it, but the college or the education that Moody was promoting, and they had Mennonite schooling there, so let's do something that's safe.
Yeah. Okay. So that's another reason Mennonite colleges started, because the people were going to other colleges. So, and lots of Christian educational institutions were forming during this time. Fundamentalist colleges too, because again, it was seen very necessary to teach people how you should believe right and not be swept up with this whole modernist thinking. And so Mennonites also started. Now, what were we just studying for Wednesday nights prior to starting this study? From what book? Big thick blue book. Doctrines of the Bible, written by Daniel Kaufman. Okay, so I think it would be accurate to say Doctrines of the Bible by Daniel Kaufman, and actually it was written by a larger group of people than just Kaufman, even though he wrote probably most of it. That's what tribe of Mennonites copied the fundamentals. Now, why do I say that? In what way is that copying the fundamentals? What do you have in Doctrines of the Bible? You have go ahead.
A list of things we believe.
Yeah. got these, point A and subpoint on God, on the Bible, and on angels, and so on. Now, there's so much that's good about that, and we appreciate his work to this day. And, we study it, lots of churches do. What problem might that have? What concern might we have with a book like Doctrines of the Bible? As much as we appreciate it, it could take the place of the Bible. That's a very good point. I'm thinking of something just a little different, but that's probably just as valid as what I'm thinking of. What makes it so? If we read Doctrines of the Bible and we get it all right, we understand it all perfectly, will that make us Christian?
Correct theology without the correct practical spiritual application of it.
If you read Mennonite, all the time he's saying you must be born again. He's just, the born again person will understand this. And it's unless you're regenerated and have a new birth and you're a new person and have experienced Jesus through faith, that's what makes you Christian. Whereas, if you just study Doctrines of the Bible, now Doctrines of the Bible teaches that, and get it, we appreciate it. But suddenly, there was this new emphasis that to think right, and to have our beliefs all right and orderly will make you Christian, and will maybe even improve or, make Christians better. And that's all borrowed from fundamentalism. Now, it's also in this period, some of you might like this, some of you might not. It's also in this period that more detailed standard booklets are being made. And there's a couple reasons for this. One is because the world really is changing. But the other is there's kind of this borrowing from the fundamentalists. And we're not saying this is all bad, okay? Please understand me. Where that if you're very detailed, you can kind of push back against these influences and can make people go right. So kind of up into kind of the 1900s, when Mennonites talked about standards of practice, they were primarily restrictive in nature. Meaning, so let's just take clothing, for example. Actually, that's a real clear example. So, prior to maybe about the 1920s, the biggest problem in clothing was the issue of pride. And, Mennonites and Amish understood that we should walk humbly before the Lord and we should not be ostentatious and showy. And in many ways, the world was like that. And so, clothing could be very made up and lacy and, really dressed and laid it on in ways that were prideful and showy. And so the need was to teach and to teach restrictions. Okay, so don't have all this lace and don't have coats that are showy, but have clothing that's just more simple. Well, along came the 1920s. Does anyone know what the decade of the 1920s is called? The Roaring Twenties. And it was a decade after World War I of just lots of economies were just exploding. There was money, there was wealth, and there was something else happening. For the first time in sexually indecent. And it was the period, anybody know what the girls were called in the 1920s? The flappers. And, you know, that was the young, and it was not, you dressed in certain ways if you were a flapper. And it was just the beginning of very shocking immodesty and indecency. And so, kind of for the first time, the shift started to happen when Mennonites were needing to address this thing where, remember I said standards tend to be more restrictive, don't have things that were prideful. But now, there was felt the need to be prescriptive. That is, you need to wear a certain, okay, now your skirt should be so long, or the neck needs to be closed up in a certain way, or the coat should be made in a certain way. Do you see the difference of why that need was felt? Again, it's this respond, this flood coming in, and we're responding to it. Because this is new, it's a new era. When suddenly, you know, people are walking around very indecent. And so you can't just say, you know, don't have quite as much lace, but then suddenly you're going to have to prescribe what this dress needs to, or this coat needs to look like, if you want it to have some kind of uniformity. Now, so couple that with the influence of fundamentalism. Mennonites in the 1920s, that's when we developed the so-called regulation dress. And so things like cape dress for ladies became standardized. Straight cut suit for men. Now, the men wore that kind of collar, but suddenly this thing became kind of a regulation or a pattern that, you know, was kind of uniformly expected. And then there were church leaders that pushed for strong authoritarian leadership to enforce these rules so that, you know, we can get people on the right path. Well, it actually didn't work real well, and there was a big kind of counter movement, but that'll be in a later lesson of what happened in the 40s through the 60s. But it did bring some helpful change too. But those were changes that fundamentalism affected. Now, one more that I just want to point out. I thought I brought. I bring so much stuff and I lose part of it in the shuffle. And I fear that might have. Okay, well I don't see it. Just have one of my booklets. Okay, what I have here is the Confession of Faith. That's the Dortrecht Confession of Faith. How many have heard of Dortrecht Confession? Yep, you've heard it. Okay, I just want to read to you Article 1 is concerning God and the creation of all things. Whereas it is declared that without faith it is impossible to please him, and that he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. Therefore we confess with the mouth and believe with the heart, together with the pious, according to the Holy Scriptures, that there is one eternal, almighty, and incomprehensible God, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, and none more and none other, before whom no God existed. And on it goes, talking about God. And if you go to the Apostles' Creed, that old creed that was developed in the early church, it starts with, we believe in God the Father, and so on. Now, does anyone know how the Mennonite Confession of Faith that was developed in 1921 and then changed again in the 1960s, and this, I don't guess any of the ministers, nobody has the construction class book with you, do you? Because it's back there. Okay, I brought one along, but can't find it. Does anyone know what Article 1 is in the Mennonite Confession of Faith? What is it concerning?
The Bible is inerrant.
The inerrant, inspired, and on and on. It has a lot of big, big language there. Where do you think Mennonites got that? Where? The fundamental. Where we got it? Is that a good change? What do you think?
It seems reactive. So I don't know if it's good.
Where does salvation start? Start with the Bible or start with God? Okay. And you see, we think a little different about the Bible too. Does anybody know what the Anabaptists said about the Bible related to the sign on the end? I said this in Bible school too, Duncan. You remember this one? I can't expect you to remember every time. Okay, there's the early Anabaptists said that they emphasized the outer word and the inner word. And they said, what you see here is the outer word. And that can't say anything. You have to experience the inner word. And they said that the printed paper, and that's like the sign outside the inn that is advertising the wine. The wine is inside. And unless you come here by faith with a believing heart, this won't do anything. Now, the outer word can lead you to the inner word, but it's the inner word that is dynamic, that's living. Now, in fundamentalism, you get the idea that this is actually dynamic. Now, if you read, I think you'll understand what I mean if you start getting around these people. Now, I don't know that it's all bad, but it can have pitfalls. And it can miss the heart of what it is. I might get in big trouble here, but just like the whole young earth creationist movement, that came up in the 1940s, defending the Bible, and doing so with huge pushback. And again, there's much we can appreciate about it, but it's like Answers in Genesis. They put such a huge if you don't get Genesis 1 to 11 right, you're done. It's over. You went over that liberal cliff. Now, is that really true? Is that the heart of the gospel, Genesis 1 to 11? It's important, not minimizing that, but is that really where we are as an Anabaptist people? Is that what early Anabaptists would have said? We can think about that. Okay, I rattled long enough. Any other discussion or questions? We'll go home.
One of the things that I appreciate other input on this opinions, but one of the things I see as a great tragedy with some of this is that it's taken the scientific observations that we've made through time and it's turned it into a lever with an agenda to try and change the way people think instead of just making it an observation and a movement forward. Bible, creation, God, and science, they're not mutually exclusive. But so much of society has created that so that it makes it even difficult to have conversations with people who are in medicine and science because you immediately are rejected in any kind of discussion because your perspectives are a little bit different. It just seems like a great tragedy.
Right. So science and the orderliness of the world of the universe is over here, and God is over here.
It has become faith-based.
And you
I mean,
can't.
we've even heard it in Acts where they say, well, you can't be a science denier. Well, what does that mean? That means that you're worshiping something that's nebulous and is only a power of observation. And it's a great tool and it's created a lot of wondrous things, but it doesn't deny God. It's very sad.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else? All right. Let's stand. And Uncle Henry, would